Hey, Cypher here, and this is the final episode of my California history series. It's been 7 years in the making. Maybe I'll create something to wrap up the whole thing. Tell me what you think I should do in the comments below. This episode is on the history of Silicon Valley, but also more generally the rise of technology that the region now represents. It can be viewed in isolation, but the context of the rest of the Golden State's history is always something useful. This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and Incogni. The internet came about as part of the rise of Silicon Valley, as we will see in this episode. It's kind of fundamental to humanity's existence now, but there are some serious downsides to how it all functions. The way this platform, as in YouTube, makes its money is primarily through AdSense. They've got to collect your data in order to market to you better. But Google is perhaps the most scrupulous with that information. Others are not. Dozens of brokers collect everything they can about you. There isn't much they can't get at. From stuff as simple as your name, address, and background, to much more private info like relatives, personal habits, and social security numbers. All of that, these brokers sell to whoever is willing to pay. Just think of the times you've mentioned an object in conversation, and then it shows up as an ad to buy on social media, or when you registered for a website and then get bombarded with spam. Well, Incogni can help. When I signed up, within a week, they'd already had my data removed from over 30 brokers and are working on many more. They actively pester brokers to remove your data from their systems, and with their more detailed view, you can see how many are being resistant and which are taking their sweet time. I certainly saw a reduction in spam after using this service. Plus, who knows what other harmful data they managed to get removed. So if you go to incogni.com/cynicalhistorian and use code cynicalhistorian, you'll get 60% off an annual Incogni plan, linked below. Thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this, and on with the show. Silicon Valley is not a clearly defined place. It could just be Palo Alto, or as far away as the rest of the Southern Bay Area, from Berkeley all the way around to San Francisco. The main thing is that the region is the center of the technological renaissance in microchip and internet innovation. But it hasn't always been the tech capital of the world, nor even of the United States. Indeed, at the end of World War II, the Boston area was the contender of that title because of MIT and Harvard. A few decades later, and there was no doubt as to Silicon Valley's ascension. Computing did not begin with microchips, though. There were mechanical calculators going back to the 17th century, and mechanical computers started a couple centuries later. In the early 20th century, an invention that developed in what would become the Silicon Valley was the triode vacuum tube, which enabled electronic computers. This was more happenstance than a being of a center of innovation, though. ENIAC was the first digital programmable general-purpose computer completed in Pennsylvania in 1945. Silicon transistors were not practical yet, and it took until the Harwell Cadet in 1955 England for a full-fledged computer to be made on that tech. The transition to silicon transistors was the root of Silicon Valley's ascendancy. Plenty of research and development capacity centered on California before the valley's rise. Aircraft companies were most prominent in the Golden State before World War II, thanks to its fair weather. Caltech created the Jet Propulsion Laboratory before the war. During the war, what would become Edwards Air Force Base was an important part of aviation testing. The Manhattan Project centered on UC Berkeley scientists, who ran Los Alamos Labs for 7 decades. Stanford University in Palo Alto, whose programs have been more practically oriented since its establishment in 1891, took part in all this Californian innovation. In 1937, the brothers Russell and Sigurd Varian invented the klystron at Stanford, the first tube that could emit microwave radiation. This became helpful in making radar small enough to fit in airplanes. The invention became the foundation for the Stanford Research Institute, or simply SRI, in 1946, which focused on practical research into technological development. The defense aviation company Lockheed was in SoCal, but they opened a factory in Sunnyvale to take advantage of Stanford in 1956. These two poles formed the basis of Silicon Valley, with SRI doing research and Lockheed providing the bulk of jobs in the region into the 1990s. What funded all of this was federal expenditure for aerospace engineering, especially as the arms and space races ramped up. Transistor tech was what gave Silicon Valley its name, but they were extremely temperamental to begin with. William Shockley grew up in Palo Alto. He invented a way to manufacture a functional silicon semiconductor and started his Mountain View plant in 1955, the same year as the Harwell Cadet. These transistors and diodes were solid state, as in no moving parts, unlike vacuum tubes, plus they weren't fragile glass. This was the future of computing, but Shockley was the worst kind of hateful boss. He'd become quite the racist in his later years, leveraging his Nobel laurels to bring back Stanford's eugenics past. 8 of his engineers left to form their own semiconductor company, which Shockley always called the Traitorous 8. They joined aerospace tycoon Sherman Fairchild to create Fairchild Semiconductor in 1957. This company figured out how to make better silicon transistors that linked them all on a chip, called the planar process. Using this process, Robert Noyce created the first integrated circuits on a single silicon wafer, the basis of all CPUs today. The biggest contracts for these chips was the government, specifically for aerospace, military, and computer equipment. Because of an underhanded way Fairchild had financed the corporation, a bunch of engineers spun off their own companies called Fairchildren. These were famous firms that we have today, such as Intel, AMD, and National Semiconductor. Intel would create the first microprocessor in 1971, making much smaller computers possible. Given how many companies formed in connection to all this, there is somewhat of a family tree to Silicon Valley corporations. The orchards of the South Bay were quickly filling up with startups. From the 1960s onward, capitalists sought out the next new venture to invest in, making venture capital an integral part of how Silicon Valley developed. The archetypal example started as a minor electrical parts company with Bill Hewitt and David Packard in their 1939 garage and were chugging away prior to all this silicon tech, making oscillators. But in 1966, they started manufacturing what was called a mini-computer with Fairchild chips, which were essentially small mainframes. From there, they branched out and continued to evolve with electronics manufacturing. As the Vietnam War heated up, the reliance on federal funding chafed many. The growing counterculture centered on San Francisco, and the rest of the Bay Area felt it. This instilled a sense of libertarianism in the electronics industry. The next generation of entrepreneurs would use all this innovation, paid for by the government, to privatize it, symbolized by the separation of SRI from Stanford in 1970 through 76. Not that Stanford stopped innovating. A joint patent between them and the UC system was for recombinant DNA. So a San Francisco company called Genentech formed to make bioengineered products with the new tech, and they manufactured bacteria-growing insulin for the first time in 1978. This was the birth of the biotech industry. The hippie ideal was best illustrated by the prevalence of local freakers and hackers. Freakers, spelled with a PH rather than an F, were people who figured out phone frequencies for payphones and used that to get free calls. At this time, hacker meant someone who would hack together their own computer. An example of this was the gaming culture surrounding university computers. Students used the power of their mainframes to play games. A popular one was Space War, which came out in 1962. A duo named Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney tried to bring a simplified version of this game to arcades. Their newly formed company, called Atari, made Computer Space in 1971, though it only used hacked television circuits rather than a computer. But it wasn't popular at first. They operated on a shoestring budget, but pushed forward with a different arcade game by hiring Al Alcorn to build it. Another Bay Area company made their own games before that could happen, though. In 1972, San Francisco radio company Magnavox brought gaming to television. They'd been trying to compete with their local rival Ampex, who'd created the first commercially viable audio tape and videotape recording tech. Magnavox brought a simple interactive device that had been in the works since 1966 out in '72. The Odyssey was the first game console, but Magnavox was now competing with Atari instead of Ampex. Sneakily, Bushnell had ripped off one of the Odyssey's games, which was in turn based on a 1958 game called Tennis for Two. Pong was a massive hit for a company that literally used coffee cans as a coin tray and hatchet-wielding wives to run security while they collected those coins. 2 years later, after Bushnell had excluded Dabney, Atari made a home console version of Pong, and in 1977, their first multi-game console came out, later known as the 2600. They had gone from hackers to entrepreneurs. Fairchild Semiconductor had been the first to bring a cartridge-fed console to market a year before Atari with the Channel F, but it didn't sell well. The video game market crashed in 1983, and Silicon Valley companies didn't become dominant again in the industry, even though there are still plenty of game developers in California, such as Activision, which former Atari employees created in 1979. Video games started with that countercultural spirit, leeching off of federally funded computing and liberating that tech for the masses. Clubs popped up all over the Bay Area for hackers like Bushnell. One in particular focused on a 1974 microcomputer called the Altair 8800, which came from an Albuquerque-based company using a groundbreaking Intel processor, the 8080. This was basically the first home computer, but it didn't have a screen or even particular ways of input. Hackers came together at the Homebrew Club to discuss this new device, starting in March of 1975. This club became a focal point for a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. One incident involving the Homebrew Club illustrates the libertarianism of early hackers and presaged much of what the Valley would become. They were copying the basic programming code for the Altair without paying the new company in Albuquerque that made it, called Microsoft. One of its founders, Bill Gates, sent a letter complaining about the piracy, but they kept making copies of the software anyways. Gates wanted to lock down software development, while hackers preferred to have plenty of people working on innovation. These mindsets were memorably termed the cathedral versus the bazaar. Two homebrew freakers taking advantage of the bazaar were known as the Two Steves, Jobs and Wozniak, who had formed another garage startup called Apple. Jobs worked for Atari and Woz at HP. They slapped together a small computer and demonstrated it at the club in 1976, starting production immediately. They created a very limited number of Apple I's, but a better version came out a year later. Despite a flashy introduction of the Apple II, it didn't become popular until it had an application for everyday office use, rather than simply the realm of hobbyists. That was VisiCalc, the first killer app in 1979. Now that there was a business application, the biggest computer manufacturer in the world, known as Big Blue, decided to step in. New York-based IBM created a rapid development program to make their own personal computer in a secret facility in Florida. After having failed to break into the portable computer market in 1960, 75, and 80 with their 1401, 5100, and 5120, this new project was codenamed the 5150. They approached Microsoft to port their BASIC to PC. The most popular operating system at the time was CP/M, programmed in Monterey, California. IBM sought to license it, but were put off by the loose business practices of CP/M creator Gary Kildall, taking a page from the very thing Gates famously denounced just a few years prior. Microsoft made their own OS using CP/M code. called MS-DOS. The IBM PC released in August of 1981 using the Intel 8088. So it still used Silicon Valley tech, but companies like Apple felt edged out of the marketplace, even putting up a pirate flag over their headquarters. Within a year, other computer companies were nipping away at Big Blue's dominance. Compaq created the first IBM-compatible PC, and a slew of others followed. Companies like Apple instead focused on making more usable computers. There had long been a vision of what computing could be. Government funding in 1963 created the Augmentation Research Center at SRI, ran by Douglas Engelbart. He experimented with ways to make computers more accessible, such as inventing the mouse, graphic user interface, or GUI, peer-to-peer networking, and many more. He showed off all of this in what has become known the mother of all demos in 1968. The following year, Xerox created their Palo Alto Research Center. They developed a number of technologies based on Engelbart's vision, but couldn't bring them to market because of Xerox's lethargic production cycle. Other companies did that instead. One, for instance, was Adobe, who used the visualization aspects of Xerox's Palo Alto tech to program accurate ways of printing, which developed into a suite of creativity tools. The most important of these Xerox-originated developments was a commercial form of the GUI. Apple brought the first one to market in early 1983, and then a much cheaper version a year later. Microsoft released Windows a year after that, and by then they had moved to Seattle, so they were directly competing with Silicon Valley. After the release of Windows 3.0 in 1990, and already having been dominant because of MS-DOS, they were raking in the most money from the burgeoning PC market, which meant Seattle seemed poised to take the crown from Silicon Valley. A substantial earthquake prior to that release seemed to bode poorly. With its epicenter only a little south of Silicon Valley, it killed 63 people. The Cold War was coming to a close, too. The Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc fell apart in 1989 through 91, so government funding was drying up. At the same time, politicians were realizing the need to keep the tech sector going strong. Some were known as Atari Democrats, but there were prominent Republicans like Newt Gingrich pushing for tax breaks and subsidies to tech companies, which eventually led to the 1992 passage of the Scientific and Advanced Technology Act, doing exactly what Atari Democrats wanted. Later on that year, an Atari Democrat was elected to the White House. Silicon Valley started with dependence on federal funding, and their libertarianism made them pretend to be independent, despite ongoing government support through privatization. They used this individualism myth to resist unionization efforts while still maintaining government favoritism. Nowhere was that more apparent than how a military resource became the origin of the next bonanza for Silicon Valley. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, later renamed to DARPA, had begun an initiative to interconnect Department of Defense workstations in 1966. SRI created the Interface Message Processors and sent the first message to UCLA in 1969. More computers linked to what was called ARPANET required a suite of protocols throughout the 1970s to make it functional, now called TCP/IP, the backbone of the internet today. Xerox PARC invented Ethernet networking and made way for internet providers linking people via phones, aka dial-up. The military part of ARPANET broke off in 1983, and the National Science Foundation set up their own network that allowed for switching domain names in 1986. By 1990, several other networks and exchanges had popped up. That year, a team at CERN, under Tim Berners-Lee, invented the World Wide Web, a way to display information from these interconnects. Users simply needed a way to browse websites with a single application. CERN developed the first web browser, but it wasn't popular. The National Center for Supercomputing Applications developed Mosaic in 1993, which became the basis of a proprietary browser that was commercially successful by 1995. That was Netscape. This Silicon Valley company's initial public offering was a massive success, and it set set off a mania for startups that took advantage of the new tech. Local computer company Sun Microsystems created JavaScript, which allows for browser-based applications and much less clunky websites. Silicon Valley filled to the brim with new companies, often with .com at the end of their names. A signal of their inevitable doom was how Microsoft bundled their own browser with Windows. Internet Explorer destroyed the origin of the Silicon Valley bubble, Netscape, leading to it getting bought by America Online in 1999, which had started as a dial-up service provider going all the way back to the Atari 2600. Breaking from Netscape a year before that, Mozilla produced Firefox as a better alternative to Explorer, but remained secondary until Chrome became popular around 2011. Microsoft's ability to assimilate and monopolize earned it the California moniker of the Borg. Another foreboding issue was the fear that numerous systems would crash due to not being able to compute the year 2000 correctly, though the Y2K bug was easily patched. By late 2000, web companies were dropping like flies, the dot-com bubble burst, and the stock market plummeted after the 9/11 attacks. Nonetheless, Silicon Valley always finds a way out of each economic slump. For instance, a company formed by two Stanford students in 1998 survived the dot-com bubble bursting. Google became the more preferred search engine over Yahoo in the early 2000s. They used their prominence to gather data and personalize ads. They used that income to expand into other internet-based enterprises, especially in the vacuum left by so many crashed companies. One of their prime expansions was into cloud computing. Much like how time-sharing terminals allowed access to mainframes in the 60s and 70s, putting processing in the cloud allowed for a massive expansion of capabilities, but it requires server farms. It is that power and Google's wealth that permitted them to acquire this platform and grow it. Social media like YouTube arose and mostly came to Silicon Valley. Facebook started in Harvard, but it moved to Palo Alto in 2004, before its founder, Mark Zuckerberg, had even graduated. He dropped out instead. Facebook started as a private social network for only college students in 2003. There were plenty of earlier social networks, such as The Globe, Friendster, and MySpace, but Facebook took over with ease once it went fully public in 2006. Twitter started that same year with its headquarters in San Francisco. Another startup that is now dependent on massive servers is Netflix in Los Gatos. It started in 1997 as a movie rental company where you could order online and receive DVDs by mail. Starting in 2007, you could stream those movies as well, becoming the basis of streaming services, though Hulu launched in Santa Monica that same year. Netflix grew enough to launch its own studio. These web developments cemented Silicon Valley as a technology leader, enough to make it through the Great Recession without having a serious decline in employment. A new device category came to lead the way for further development and take advantage of this information revolution. The miniaturization of computers did not end with the PC. The same year the IBM PC came out, the first commercially viable, portable all-in-one computer released from Osborne, another Bay Area startup. Laptops quickly came out after that. Palm tops, or PDAs, with more than a couple lines of screen, came out in the late 1980s, with HP, Atari, and Apple all having their own variants. The first smartphone released in 1994 by IBM. In 1996, HP's Palm Top got a cellular modem. A year later, Sunnyvale-based Palm Pilot released a popular PDA. These were all very clunky. They needed polish and power, and Steve Jobs was the man to bring that to fruition. He had resigned from Apple after it lost its bid for dominance in the mid-1980s. He co-founded Next Computers just after that. In 1986, he worked with another Silicon Valley company to use his computers while they brought computer-generated imagery to Hollywood, becoming its primary investor and chairman. This was Pixar, and they'd obviously go on to have a huge effect on the industry. You can thank Silicon Valley for CGI. Apple eventually brought Jobs back in 1997 and bought Next. He discontinued the Newton PDAs. Instead, Apple would become the leader for more polished tech. First came the iMac, then iBook, and finally the iPod, an MP3 player that quickly took over the market after its release in 2001. Such devices had been around since at least 1996, but Apple successfully made it more appealing. They would do the same with smartphones 6 years later. Canadian BlackBerry smartphones were already popular, and Google had a project to make software for it, but they pivoted to make an iPhone competitor instead, revealing Android 10 months after Apple's iPhone reveal. Google would, for the most part, not make their own hardware, save for the Nexus and Pixel lines. Either way, Android and iPhone would come to dominate the smartphone market, both Silicon Valley companies. Consolidation has largely defined the Valley's history ever since 2008. These companies gobble up startups. The industry started with the traitorous 8 leaving the first semiconductor company and dividing it up from there with the Fairchildren. In a way, they are just bringing the Valley back to that principle, each corporation covering its separate sector or holding a duopoly. But Silicon Valley has a way of reinventing itself and remains the leader in high technology. For instance, the electric car company, Tesla, began there. The region contains too much innovation to keep track of everything. Who knows what might come next? Be sure to check out Incogni by using code CynicalHistorian at the link below for 60% off. First to bring a cartridge-fed graphic user face